If you had told me that a $120,000 luxury pool would end up serving 200 thirsty cattle before it ever hosted a single swimmer, I would have laughed and gone back to fixing fence posts. But that is exactly what happened on my ranch. My name is Jack Sullivan, and I own a stretch of pasture land just outside a growing subdivision in Central Texas. The land has been in my family for decades, long before anyone thought about gated entrances, decorative fountains, or neighborhood committees with fancy titles. Every morning started about the same way for me. I would be up before sunrise, check the water systems, inspect the fencing, and make sure my cattle had everything they needed. It was a routine built on consistency, and in ranching, consistency matters. The cattle depended on it, the land depended on it, and honestly, so did I. That particular morning started differently. I was driving my utility vehicle across the eastern pasture when I noticed something unusual near the property line. Even from a distance, I could see a crowd forming. At first, I thought maybe a section of fence had come down overnight. Then I realized the crowd wasn't people. It was cattle. Nearly my entire herd had gathered in one area, packed together tighter than usual. I picked up speed. As I got closer, I saw something that made me stop cold. Right in the middle of a section of land near the subdivision sat a massive in-ground pool. Not a stock tank. Not an irrigation basin. A real swimming pool with stone decking, decorative tile, lounge chairs, and landscaping. The thing looked like it belonged behind a luxury resort. The problem was that my cattle had discovered it before any homeowners had. Several animals stood around the edges drinking water while others crowded in behind them waiting their turn. The scene looked so ridiculous that I genuinely wondered if I was still half asleep. I climbed out of the vehicle and stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I heard shouting. Across the pool deck, a woman in oversized designer sunglasses was waving her arms and yelling at contractors, landscapers, and anyone else within hearing distance. Even from 50 yards away, I recognized her immediately. Patricia Monroe, president of the local HOA. Around town, most people simply called her Karen. Patricia was impossible to miss. She favored bright designer outfits, expensive jewelry, and the kind of attitude that suggested she believed every conversation was a staff meeting she was running. Over the previous several months, she had made it her personal mission to tell everyone how things should be done. Looking at the pool and the chaos surrounding it, I had a feeling her latest project had gone very wrong. One contractor was flipping through paperwork. Another was talking into a phone. Meanwhile, my cattle continued treating the expensive new installation like the biggest watering station they had ever seen. The strangest part was that nobody seemed prepared for this outcome. Patricia certainly wasn't. She looked furious, confused, and increasingly desperate as more residents arrived to see what the commotion was about. I didn't say a word at first. I just stood there watching the situation unfold. Because while everyone else seemed focused on the pool, I was focused on something far more important. I knew exactly where that structure had been built, and if I was right, Patricia Monroe had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The reason I knew Patricia Monroe had a serious problem was simple. My family had owned that section of land for longer than most people in the county could remember. My grandfather bought the original acreage decades ago when the nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive and the subdivision did not exist. Over the years, pieces of farmland around us were sold and developed, but we kept our operation running. The eastern pasture where everyone was now gathered had always been part of the ranch. I had the surveys, tax records, and property maps to prove it. Standing there that morning, I watched Patricia march across the pool deck while talking rapidly into her phone. She pointed toward my cattle, then toward the water, then toward a group of contractors who looked increasingly uncomfortable. A few homeowners stood nearby whispering among themselves. Some looked annoyed. Others looked embarrassed. One man simply sat in a folding chair staring at the scene like he could not believe what he was watching. I climbed back into my utility vehicle and headed toward the ranch office instead of joining the argument. There was no reason to rush. The facts were not going to change. 10 minutes later, I was sitting at my desk pulling old files from a cabinet that had been organized the same way for years. Inside were property surveys, easement agreements, county correspondence, and records dating back generations. I spread everything across the desk and found the document I wanted most. It was a certified survey completed several years earlier when the subdivision was first proposed. The boundary lines were clear. There was no confusion. The area where the pool now sat belonged to me. As I reviewed the paperwork, I could not help thinking back to when Patricia first arrived in the neighborhood. She had moved into one of the larger homes near the entrance and quickly became the most visible person in the homeowners association. At first, I assumed she was simply enthusiastic. Then the letters started arriving. One complained that my fencing was unattractive from the road. Another claimed my cattle created an undesirable rural appearance. One even suggested that I should relocate feeding areas because residents preferred a more scenic view from their walking trail. Every request carried the same assumption that her organization somehow had authority over property it did not own. I ignored most of it because there was nothing to discuss. My ranch was not part of the subdivision and never had been. Still, Patricia never seemed willing to accept that answer. Every few weeks, she came up with a new concern, a new proposal, or a new demand. Looking back, the pattern seemed obvious. She had convinced herself that if she pushed hard enough, reality would eventually agree with her. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller identification showed a county surveyor I had worked with before. When I answered, he sounded exhausted. He asked if I had seen what was happening near the eastern boundary. I told him I had. After a brief pause, he said something that immediately caught my attention. According to him, several people had recently requested copies of old property maps, and the information they received might explain exactly how this entire mess started. For the first time that day, I realized the pool itself might only be part of a much bigger story. The county surveyor agreed to meet me later that afternoon, and by the time I arrived at his office, he already had several documents spread across a conference table. He pointed to two nearly identical maps. At first glance, they looked the same, but a closer look revealed the problem. One was an official certified survey showing the actual property boundaries. The other was a simplified development map created years earlier for marketing materials when the subdivision was being advertised to potential buyers. The simplified version showed landmarks, walking paths, and common areas, but it was never intended to establish ownership. The surveyor explained that someone had recently requested copies of old records and appeared to have relied heavily on the simplified map instead of the certified survey. Suddenly, everything began making sense. Patricia had probably convinced herself that the open pasture near the subdivision belonged to a future community recreation area. If that was true, then she had spent months operating under a completely false assumption. The surveyor shook his head and told me he had already received multiple phone calls that morning. Contractors wanted clarification. Homeowners wanted answers. Someone from the homeowners association had even asked whether property lines could be adjusted after construction. His expression suggested he already knew the answer to that question. Before leaving, I requested updated certified copies of every relevant document. I was not preparing for a fight. I simply believed in keeping records organized when confusion started spreading. Back at the ranch, I found several new emails waiting in my inbox. Most came from subdivision residents. A few apologized for the situation. Others asked polite questions about the history of the land. One message stood out from the rest. It came from a member of the Homeowners Association board. The email was short but revealing. According to him, several board members had never fully supported Patricia's recent projects. Over the past year, she had pushed aggressively for upgrades intended to make the neighborhood appear more exclusive. Decorative entrances, expanded landscaping, additional amenities, and increasingly ambitious community improvements had become her focus. Apparently, the pool project had been presented as the crown jewel of that effort. The board member also mentioned something else. Patricia had assured everyone that ownership questions were already resolved. Reading that sentence twice, I leaned back in my chair. That was not a small misunderstanding. That was the foundation upon which the entire project had been approved. As evening approached, I drove out toward the eastern pasture again. The crowd had mostly disappeared. A few contractors remained, speaking quietly near a pickup truck. The expensive landscaping around the pool already looked less impressive than it had that morning. Without the excitement of a grand opening, it seemed strangely out of place sitting beside open ranch land. One contractor recognized me and walked over. After introducing himself, he asked a question that immediately caught my attention. He wanted to know whether I had ever signed any authorization forms related to construction access on that section of land. When I told him I had not, the color seemed to drain from his face. Then he revealed something I had not heard before. Someone had provided paperwork claiming the project site belonged to the association, and based on what he was now learning, those documents might not have been accurate at all. The contractor introduced himself as Mark Reynolds and looked like a man who had not enjoyed his day. He held a folder under one arm and kept glancing back toward the pool as if hoping the entire structure might somehow disappear before morning. He explained that his company specialized in high-end residential amenities and had been hired months earlier through the Homeowners Association. According to the documents he received, the project site was represented as association-controlled property reserved for future community development. Everything from permits to site plans had been submitted based on that understanding. I asked whether anyone had ever contacted me regarding access, surveys, or boundary verification. Mark shook his head immediately. He said that normally, for a project of this size, multiple layers of ownership verification would occur before construction began. The unusual part was that the association representatives seemed extremely confident that all ownership questions had already been resolved. Hearing that confirmed what I had been suspecting. This was not a last-minute mistake. This misunderstanding had been building for months. Over the next few days, I learned more from conversations with residents than I had during the previous year. Once the situation became public, people started talking. Several homeowners told me Patricia had spent nearly every board meeting promoting her vision for transforming the subdivision into one of the most desirable communities in the county. She talked about prestige. She talked about property values. She talked about creating amenities that would attract attention. The proposed pool became the centerpiece of that vision. Residents were shown presentations, design concepts, landscaping plans, and artist renderings. Many supported the idea because they believed it would improve the neighborhood. What they did not realize was that the entire proposal depended on a piece of land the association did not actually own. One homeowner forwarded me copies of community newsletters. Reading through them was surprisingly informative. Month after month, Patricia described the future recreation area as if its existence were already guaranteed. She referred to the location as a planned community asset. She discussed future events that might take place there. She even highlighted expected construction timelines. The confidence in those updates was remarkable considering the underlying ownership issue. Meanwhile, I continued managing the ranch exactly as I always had. The cattle still needed water. Fences still needed repairs. Feed deliveries still arrived on schedule. Yet every day brought another phone call or email connected to the growing controversy. Then a particularly interesting message arrived from a homeowner named Linda Carter. She had served on a planning committee during the early stages of the project. According to Linda, concerns about the land had actually been raised months earlier. During one meeting, a board member reportedly asked whether an updated survey should be obtained before committing significant funds. Patricia dismissed the concern. She reportedly insisted that old maps already proved the association's rights to the property. If Linda's account was accurate, someone had an opportunity to prevent this entire situation and chose not to take it. That evening, I reviewed the certified surveys again and organized every relevant document into a single file. I still was not looking for a confrontation. I simply wanted facts available if questions continued. As I finished sorting paperwork, my phone buzzed with a new notification. The Homeowners Association had announced an emergency board meeting for the following night. And judging from the messages already appearing in neighborhood discussion groups, it was going to be a very uncomfortable meeting for Patricia Monroe. The emergency board meeting drew more attention than any community event the subdivision had hosted in years. I did not attend, but by the following morning I had heard enough accounts to piece together a fairly accurate picture of what happened. Residents packed the room. Board members arrived carrying binders, printed emails, and copies of project budgets. Contractors attended remotely. What was supposed to be a routine discussion quickly turned into a long series of uncomfortable questions. The first issue involved ownership of the land. Multiple residents wanted to know why an updated survey had never been ordered before construction began. Others wanted to know who approved the final location. According to several people who were present, Patricia spent much of the meeting insisting that everyone had relied on information believed to be accurate at the time. That explanation did not satisfy many homeowners. The project represented a major financial commitment, and people wanted more than assumptions. Over the next several days, additional details emerged. The association had invested a significant amount of money into the project. Design consultants had been hired. Landscaping plans had been commissioned. Contractors had been scheduled months in advance. Residents who initially supported the pool began asking whether proper verification procedures had been followed. More importantly, they started asking who would be responsible if the project could not remain where it had been built. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued as normal, although the pool created an unexpected complication. The decorative water feature had become extremely popular with my cattle. Every morning I would drive past and find groups of animals gathering near the area. They were not causing damage. They were simply taking advantage of an easily accessible water source. The irony was impossible to ignore. Something intended as a luxury neighborhood attraction had become a practical stop for livestock. One afternoon, I received another call from Mark Reynolds. He sounded more frustrated than before. His company had started conducting an internal review of project records. During that review, they discovered that several assumptions regarding property ownership traced back to information supplied by association leadership. He was careful with his wording and avoided accusations, but the message was clear. The further people looked into the project, the more questions appeared. A few days later, I noticed survey crews working near the eastern boundary. That immediately caught my attention because professional survey work usually means facts are about to replace opinions. Over the course of 2 days, crews measured distances, marked reference points, reviewed records, and documented existing conditions. Residents watched from sidewalks. Contractors stopped by periodically. Even Patricia appeared several times, although she no longer carried the same confidence she had displayed during previous encounters. Instead of directing conversations, she seemed focused on following them. By the end of the week, everyone was waiting for the same thing: the official survey results. Once those findings became available, there would be little room left for debate. Property lines would either support the association's position or confirm what I already knew from decades of records. Late Friday afternoon, a county employee left me a voicemail. The updated survey had been completed, reviewed, and finalized. After hearing the message, I had a feeling the next few days were going to change everything. I picked up the finalized survey report the following Monday morning. Before opening it, I already knew what it would say, but there is a difference between believing something and having official documentation confirm it. The report left no room for interpretation. The property boundaries matched every certified survey my family had collected over the years. The land beneath the pool belonged to my ranch. The access area used during construction crossed ranch property. Even portions of the decorative landscaping extended beyond the limits claimed by the homeowners association. By lunchtime, copies of the survey were circulating throughout the neighborhood. The reaction was immediate. Residents who had spent weeks debating possibilities suddenly had answers. More importantly, board members who had been waiting for definitive evidence now had it in writing. That afternoon, I received 3 separate calls from homeowners association members. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. First came questions about the history of the property. Then came questions about construction access. Finally came questions about what I intended to do next. My answer remained simple. I wanted accurate records respected and reasonable solutions discussed. Meanwhile, another unexpected issue was creating pressure on everyone involved. The pool's water level had started fluctuating more than expected. At first, residents assumed evaporation was responsible. After all, temperatures had been climbing steadily. However, contractors investigating the site discovered something interesting. During construction, portions of the water system had been connected to existing infrastructure near the pasture boundary. The arrangement functioned, but not exactly as originally envisioned. Because the area sat directly adjacent to grazing land, and because livestock naturally gathered around available water sources, the expensive new feature was experiencing far heavier usage than any residential planner had anticipated. Every morning brought another round of photographs shared across neighborhood discussion groups. Some residents found the situation frustrating. Others found it hilarious. One image showed a line of cattle standing patiently near the edge while homeowners watched from a distance. Another showed maintenance workers inspecting equipment while several curious animals observed from nearby. The pool had become the most talked about location in the community, but not for the reasons Patricia had promised. As public attention grew, so did scrutiny of the decision-making process. Additional board records surfaced. Meeting notes revealed repeated references to assumptions rather than verified surveys. Budget discussions reference projected benefits, but contain surprisingly little documentation regarding ownership confirmation. Residents who had previously trusted leadership without question now wanted explanations. Patricia attempted to reassure people through emails and community updates. She insisted that solutions were being explored and that the situation remained manageable. The problem was that every new document seemed to raise another question. Late in the week, Mark Reynolds called again. This time his tone was noticeably different. His company had completed its internal review, and several findings were now being shared with legal and insurance representatives. He could not discuss every detail, but he did reveal one important fact. The original project proposal included a recommendation for a fresh boundary verification before final approval. According to the records, that recommendation was never followed. After ending the call, I stared out across the pasture for several minutes. The story was no longer about a construction mistake. It was becoming a story about ignored warnings, and that realization was about to make life much harder for Patricia Monroe. By the beginning of the next week, the atmosphere inside the subdivision had changed completely. The conversations were no longer about future amenities or community improvements. They were about accountability. Homeowners wanted to know how a project of this size had moved forward despite unanswered questions. Board members who had once supported the plan now seemed focused on protecting themselves from the growing fallout. Every new meeting generated additional discussion, and every discussion led back to the same issue. The warnings had existed. The opportunities to verify ownership had existed. Yet the project had continued anyway. What surprised me most was how many residents began reaching out directly. Some wanted copies of historical property records. Others wanted clarification about the surveys. A few simply wanted to apologize for assumptions they had made earlier. For years, many of them had only heard Patricia's version of events. Now they were seeing official documents that told a very different story. One afternoon, I received a call from Linda Carter again. She sounded exhausted after attending another lengthy board session. According to her, several members had started reviewing months of meeting notes and email exchanges. As they worked through the records, a pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Questions had repeatedly been raised about boundaries, ownership, and verification. Those questions had repeatedly been dismissed. The more documentation people reviewed, the less confidence they had in the explanations being offered. Meanwhile, the situation at the pool continued attracting attention. Contractors were visiting almost daily. Survey markers remained visible around portions of the property. Residents frequently stopped nearby to observe developments. The location had unintentionally become a gathering point where neighbors exchanged updates and rumors. My cattle, of course, remained completely indifferent to the controversy. As far as they were concerned, the area was simply another place where water happened to be available. Their presence only added to the strange symbolism of the entire situation. Something designed to showcase control and prestige had become a constant reminder that reality does not always cooperate with plans. Midweek brought another significant development. Mark Reynolds contacted me with information from his company's review process. Several project documents had been examined by outside consultants. The findings reportedly confirmed that ownership verification should have occurred before final construction approval. Even more important, written recommendations supporting additional verification were now documented within project records. Hearing that changed the tone of everything. Up until that point, people could still argue about misunderstandings and assumptions. Documented recommendations were different. They showed that concerns had not only existed but had been formally identified. Later that evening, neighborhood discussion groups exploded with activity. Someone had apparently shared portions of the review findings with residents. Questions poured in. Homeowners demanded transparency. Calls for leadership changes began appearing openly. For the first time since this entire situation started, Patricia seemed unable to control the narrative. The confidence that had once defined every public statement was gone. In its place came brief updates, carefully worded explanations, and promises that further information would be provided soon. Standing on my porch that night, looking out across the pasture, I realized the story had entered a completely new phase. The debate over ownership was finished. The facts had already settled that question. What remained was determining who would ultimately bear responsibility for decisions that should never have been made in the first place. The following week brought the kind of clarity that only appears after months of confusion. Independent reviews, board discussions, contractor reports, and certified surveys had all been pointing in the same direction. Now the evidence was being organized into a complete picture. Homeowners were no longer dealing with rumors or partial information. They were seeing timelines, documents, meeting records, and written recommendations assembled side by side. As more details became available, the sequence of events became impossible to ignore. Questions about ownership had been raised. Requests for verification had been suggested. Opportunities to confirm boundaries had existed long before construction started. Yet the project moved forward anyway. Several residents told me that board meetings had become dramatically different from those held earlier in the year. Instead of discussing future plans, members spent hours reviewing records and asking who had approved specific decisions. Budget reports were examined line by line. Email chains were reviewed. Meeting notes were compared against project milestones. The process was not exciting, but it was thorough. Every answer seemed to generate 2 more questions. One afternoon, Linda Carter stopped by the ranch. She brought copies of publicly shared board summaries and gave me an overview of what residents had learned. According to her, one of the most important discoveries involved internal correspondence from the planning stage. Multiple participants had referenced the need for updated boundary confirmation before major funds were committed. Those references did not prove bad intentions. What they did prove was that uncertainty had existed from the beginning. That uncertainty should have triggered additional verification. Instead, confidence repeatedly took the place of confirmation. Meanwhile, practical realities were beginning to affect the future of the project. Insurance representatives, consultants, and contractors all needed clear answers regarding property ownership and site access. Since the official surveys were now finalized, those answers were no longer difficult to obtain. The challenge was determining what came next. Every option appeared expensive, complicated, or both. Through all of this, Patricia remained at the center of the discussion. Her public updates became less frequent as pressure increased. Residents who once supported her leadership openly questioned decisions that had previously gone unchallenged. Even homeowners who still respected her efforts admitted that the situation should have been handled differently. The shift in public opinion was impossible to miss. A person who had once controlled every conversation was now responding to conversations started by others. Then came the most significant development yet. During a heavily attended association meeting, a formal presentation summarized the findings gathered over recent weeks. The presentation included survey results, project timelines, contractor observations, planning records, and documented recommendations that had not been fully acted upon. By the end of the meeting, the room reportedly fell quiet. Not because people were confused, but because the facts were finally complete. The questions that had dominated discussion groups and neighborhood conversations for weeks had largely been answered. Later that evening, several residents forwarded copies of the summary materials to me. As I reviewed them, one thing stood out above everything else. The controversy was no longer centered on where the pool had been built. That issue had already been settled. The real story had become how so many warnings were overlooked along the way. And with that realization now shared across the entire community, major decisions regarding leadership, finances, and the future of the project were suddenly much closer than anyone had expected. Over the next month, the situation finally reached its conclusion. After reviewing the surveys, project records, contractor findings, and association documents, the Homeowners Association accepted what the evidence had been showing for weeks. The land was part of my ranch, and the project could not remain where it had been built. Discussions shifted away from arguments and toward practical solutions. Consultants were hired, plans were revised, and arrangements were made to address the construction that never should have happened in the first place. For the residents, the outcome was frustrating because many of them had supported the project in good faith. They had trusted the information they were given and expected proper verification to happen before major decisions were made. Instead, they found themselves dealing with expensive consequences that could have been avoided by a simple review of accurate property records. Leadership changes followed not long afterward. Several board positions were reevaluated, new procedures were introduced, and future projects were required to pass stricter verification standards before approval. As for Patricia Monroe, her influence within the community changed dramatically. The confidence that once allowed her to dominate every meeting was gone. People were no longer interested in promises or assumptions. They wanted documentation, facts, and accountability. Watching that shift taught me an important lesson. Authority means very little when it is disconnected from reality. No matter how certain someone appears, facts eventually matter. Through all of this, I never needed a dramatic confrontation. I never needed to raise my voice. I never needed to make threats. The documents spoke for themselves. The surveys spoke for themselves. The timeline spoke for itself. In the end, patience accomplished more than anger ever could have. Life on the ranch gradually returned to normal. The eastern pasture became quiet again. The contractors left. The meetings became less frequent. The endless phone calls slowed down. Most importantly, my cattle returned to their usual routines, completely unaware that they had become local celebrities during one of the strangest property disputes anyone in the area could remember. Sometimes neighbors still bring up the story when they see me in town. They shake their heads, laugh about how unbelievable it sounded at first, and wonder how such an obvious mistake managed to happen. My answer is always the same. People get into trouble when they stop checking facts and start relying on assumptions. It is a simple lesson, but apparently it is one that some communities have to learn the hard way. Looking back, the entire situation could have been avoided with a single updated survey and one honest conversation. Instead, months of confidence collided with a few sheets of paper that had been sitting in a filing cabinet all along. And that was the real ending to this story. Not revenge, not victory, just reality catching up with decisions that were never properly verified. Before I go, I would genuinely like to know what you think. If you were in my position, how would you have handled the situation once the facts became clear? And do you think patience was the right approach, or would you have done something differently? If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more unusual property disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and real-world lessons about common sense and accountability, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next one.